Quick little pop in here to just say that I stream 3 times a week on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday at noon Pacific time on Twitch, and I also have a VOD channel in case you want to check it out on YouTube side as well. Tunneling has been a controversial playstyle for Killer for years, but its frequency in discussion has seemingly ramped up ever since Behavior gave it direct attention in their 2025 roadmap and PTB cycles. The playstyle is best defined by a killer who will drop everything they're doing in order to kill a survivor at 4 or fewer hooks. For the survivor that gets tunneled, this can be extremely frustrating because you get to play so little of the game itself as a mere step stool for the killer's plan. While it isn't fun for a killer in public matches to play in this way, the act of tunneling somebody out gives them a much needed advantage and is the agreed upon best strategy in the competitive scene. Considering how many new perks and buffs have been introduced for the survivor role over the past 2 years as well, tunneling has become the default response for the game's perk bloat and slowly deteriorating need for skill expression, ironically on both sides. Let's start with talking about what tunneling does in the first place. Number 1, it permanently reduces generator speeds by 25% or technically greater for the rest of the match. Number 2, it shortens the web of influence that survivors can have across the map. For example, if somebody gets unhooked and one survivor is already dead, there's only one survivor that's unaccounted for instead of 2. This allows for easier patrolling of and monitoring of generators and a more guaranteed good result for the killer. Number 3, tunneling removes 4 perks from the game immediately. Instead of having to deal with the full Gen Rush suite of perks, you might get lucky enough to eliminate that person and never have to worry about it again. Or if you tunnel somebody, the person who has the Gen Rush perks won't be able to hold onto their generators for as long because they're under greater pressure. And number 4, it also guarantees that you only have to deal with 1 perk at a time. If somebody brings the common build of Den Hard, Decisive Strike, Resilience, and Finesse, well, once they use their perks once, you never have to deal with them again on that person. They are more vulnerable and an easier target after they use their perks. Additionally, if you do choose to split pressure, you'll encounter more time-wasting perks. Multiple copies of Den Hard across multiple survivors wastes more time than just 1 at a time. And plus, after dealing with the 1 copy, you get all of the previously listed benefits, which significantly weakens the remaining copies of the perks anyway. When nearly every game has at least 1 person running Hyperfocus and Stakeout, it's likely that the killer will not have time to influence the match, especially if they're inexperienced or a lower tier. Even so, as your MMR gets higher, the better the survivors get, and the more obsolete the worst killers get, and the more often that they have to rely on high-end strategies, aka tunneling. I say high-end because if we look at competitive DBD, which is a highly scrutinized and optimized version of the game, every killer is expected to tunnel even after so many concessions are made to help them. For example, if you're not familiar with competitive DBD, survivors are banned from bringing a lot of perks depending on the tier of killer that they're facing against, and the map is usually selected to best complement the killer's power. In an unpredictable and significantly less balanced environment of pub matches, it's no wonder why killers then opt to do the strongest thing. It's because they want to win. Duh. Besides the benefits though, there have been some changes to the game over the past 2 years that have been slowly coercing killers to rely on this strategy for consistent results. They weren't necessarily harmful additions to the game, but they have made a significant enough combined impact to gradually encourage killers towards tunneling. Personally, I don't have to tunnel to get 4Ks, but in the games where I don't, I sure wish I had to feel like I had a fighting chance. Here's a number of reasons why killers also have to kind of tunnel to guarantee better results. In 9.2.0, the base kit off-hook endurance and haste duration was extended to 15 seconds from the previous 10. This change unexpectedly ruined a general piece of skill expression from the killer side, picking a survivor up at the exit gate and running them to the furthest available hook instead of the nearest one. This is a common newbie mistake that one learns not to repeat after a while or after being told. Getting a last second down is often a consolation prize that doesn't end well if the survivors are coordinated and is the last chance that the killer has to capitalize on mistakes. If a survivor hits every wiggle skill check, they take 16 seconds to wiggle out of the killer's grasp. While carrying a survivor, the killer moves at 3.68 meters per second, meaning that at most, the killer clears 58.88 meters of distance in those 16 seconds. The best hooks often aren't exactly at this distance away though, so let's estimate 12 seconds on average, which is 44.16 meters of distance. Previously, when a survivor got unhooked, they got 10 seconds of endurance alongside 10 seconds of 10% haste. At survivor run speeds plus the 10%, this allowed them to clear 44 meters of distance while being basically invulnerable. Now with 15 seconds of both status effects, the unhooked survivors can move 66 meters, which, even with the killer having a perfectly distanced hook, and without any body blocks leading to the hook, this 66 meters exceeds the maximum distance that a killer can reasonably clear. You remember when they wanted to increase this to 30 seconds? 128 meters is the distance that triggers Discordance and Empathy, which is practically the entire map on most maps. 30 seconds of 10% haste is 132 meters of distance. As it is now, the best response is to bring Agitation, face camp with a certain subset of killers, or play an S-tier killer because they don't care about endurance anyway. If you aren't doing at least one of these things, you will eventually. There was a modicum of skill expression from the killer's side here, and now it's being overwritten by a change to a base mechanic, limiting a killer's options instead of rewarding them for making the most out of a mistake and forcing them to use a perk to complement this base mechanic now. And even with the old duration of 10 seconds, there was still an opportunity for the killer to make a mistake here, or to even be screwed over by map generation, or for the survivors to tank hits, but choosing to pick up now pretty much guarantees that the survivor you hook will get out of the exit gate no matter what, as long as their team is coordinated. Unhook timers in Year 8 were increased to 70 seconds from the previous 60, making hooks less of a threat when spread evenly. The only way that a killer is benefited from spreading hooks is when they're playing Scourge Hook Pain Resonance or Grim Embrace, and I guarantee you that not every killer actually wants to run this perk as they've convinced themselves of the necessity. And even then, if you do tunnel a survivor out early, you still have 3 procs of Pain Res to close the game out with, and you're not punished for not tunneling with this perk anyway. And I'll talk more about perks and stuff later, but if you want to circumvent the timers and guarantee faster hook states, then restarting a chase with a whole new quarry, then you'll have to tunnel. Behavior introduced some anti-camping measures as well, and more aggressively in the PTB cycle for 9.3.0. And this one I actually don't mind so much, because it was really annoying to play a game of Survivor and have a killer lick your toes the whole time you were on the hook with basically no repercussion, and I think that the current system is largely beneficial. What it still doesn't do is prevent killers that still really want to camp hooks from sitting just outside of the affected hook range, though these examples are few and far between. Quite often during a game though, a killer will hook a survivor in a beneficial location for them to camp out. A hooked survivor in the middle of a 3-gen towards the later parts of a game is an area that any killer would love to lock down because of how much pressure they exert over such a small area. However, since they can't sit at the hook directly because of the anti-camping changes that they wanted to make more punishing, they are instead encouraged to walk away to a minimum distance and then run straight back to the hook after the survivor is unhooked to maintain their center of control. Similar to how the unhook timers were increased, it's much easier for the killer to tunnel to make the most use out of their established foothold over the map. It's also part of the reason why teams in competitive DBD are prohibited from attempting to unhook themselves in any situation aside from using Deliverance, because camping the right area at the right time does become occasionally necessary. When the ability to rely on that necessity is taken away during public matches, killers yet again have to resort to tunneling. What's baffling to me is that Behavior's response to this tunneling playstyle was to mostly employ negative changes that had underwhelming playoffs. The generalized complaint from killers is that generators are completed too quickly, so they'd run at least one slowdown perk and tunnel so as to buy themselves more time. Now, the most direct response, even if not the correct one, would be to make generators take an extra 10 seconds to complete, or to give killers an actual incentive to not tunnel. As it stands, giving them an extra strong generator kick in exchange for an invulnerable survivor or bloodlust that saves you literally 3 meters of distance if used to its maximum duration is comparatively not enough when the current partially coerced system still takes 25% off of all remaining generator speeds. In my video where I played the masochistic slinger build, I won my 3rd game because I knew that the Claudette had no anti-tunnel perks, and I used that information to my advantage. In some ways, it is a result of me getting the correct read on Claudette, but I guarantee you that she won't be running her more boon-centric build for too much longer if this keeps happening. Instead, she's eventually going to run the build that most people do, which is something with an exhaustion perk, finesse, resilience, and a wildcard perk. Decisive Strike, Unbreakable, Windows, Dead Hard, whatever. And this back and forth way of using perks to react to whatever happened in last match in an attempt to help oneself garner better results ends up undermining build variety. You bring a build, the other side ends up playing in a way that compromises your ability to experiment or play that build because they are reacting to base mechanics, and then the natural reaction afterwards then is to bring the build that performs well instead of the fun one. Killers tunnel and bring quad slowdown, so survivors hold their left mouse button down and burn exhaustion perks. Pinpointing exactly who started this back and forth fight is impossible because both sides have equal weights to their justifications, and DBD has been out for a decade now. What I will say is that in terms of overall variety and flexibility, killer builds have gotten the short end of the stick when it comes to their strong options. After you work your way through your usual collection of Corrupt Intervention, Pain Resonance, Deadman Switch, and Pop Goes the Weasel, everything else feels relatively inadequate and situational. Sure, there are some strong perks and builds out there, but their efficacy tends to vary greatly depending on the map or killer that you play. Surge is a great perk on Deathslinger, for example, but it gets very little value on maps like Nostromo Wreckage where the generators are so spread out. Pop Goes the Weasel is a good slowdown perk, but if your killer doesn't have the mobility to choose which generator is its best target, then the perk feels underwhelming. I'm trying to get at the point that killers nowadays only have one consistently strong option when it comes to build types. If you're not bringing something that can slow the game down by damaging or blocking generators directly, you're probably playing a meme build and will lose 3 generators in less than 5 minutes. It's just the nature of things. Behavior's balancing choices also don't help this case at all, with some niche but potent perks receiving backhanded nerfs and quietly removing different build strategies from greater viability. Back in 7.6.0, anything that inflicted the mangled or hemorrhage status effect permanently was nerfed to only inflict those status effects for a set duration of time. Then, very recently, in 9.2.0, the perk Leverage was changed to only inflict 30% healing reduction to the person that unhooked instead of 50%. Leverage plus Scourge Hook Weeping Wounds was a very potent passive anti-healing build that forced survivors to stay injured more often and to not heal underneath the hook, not like you should in most scenarios anyway. But with the nerf to both of these perks, anti-healing builds lost their cornerstone and generally have fallen by the wayside. And then in between all of this, Behavior also chose to buff Botany Knowledge so that it doesn't cause medkits to lose efficiency, buff Desperate Measures by 6% at all ranks, Empathic Connection by 5%, Resurgence by 20%, while medkits themselves remain to be one of the strongest items in the game, all while Will Make It still gives you 100% healing speed for 90 seconds after you unhook somebody. These 3 perks are in the top 15% by pick rate according to Nightlight, and without anti-healing perks, there isn't a damn thing that the killer can do to prevent that. These increased healing speeds and anti-healing nerfs means that the killer is punished for splitting pressure even harder and running an anti-healing build, because if they don't go for the injured or unhooked person immediately, that person will likely get healed to full, which resets their chase timer and allows them to start safely working on generators right afterwards. It's for this reason that I don't think that generators are faster or getting completed too quickly, but more that survivor perks have gotten more efficient in completing other tasks that would have slowed them down previously. Speaking of other tasks, Hex Pentimento, and to a lesser extent Hex Thrill of the Hunt, had one of the biggest fall-offs in terms of build viability. There was a build with Fortune's Fool and Pentimento that gave the killer more hexes as the game went on, whereupon the survivor would be partially obligated to cleanse them. However, coordinated survivors would recognize that the build was designed to passively waste time and could ignore it entirely if they chose to. Either way, reigniting at least one totem was enough passive slowdown to justify bringing the build occasionally. One totem gave you generator slowdown, a second reignited totem gave you healing slowdown, then dying recovery slowdown, then exit gate opening speed slowdown, and at 5 stacks you would have all these effects and the hexes would be permanently blocked. You almost never saw this happen though, and those first 2 totems were, understandably, very strong and required responses. With this perk combination, you actively wanted to spread hooks and not tunnel so that you got as many stacks of Fortune's Fool as quickly as possible. Then came the nerfs where behavior not only reduced the generator speed debuff on the first totem, but they also made it so that pentimento totems now reveal their aura within 16 meters. In order to actually reach the power of what that first totem had before, you have to have all 5 totems active on pentimento. The counter to pentimento before was object permanence, but apparently that was too difficult for some people, so now it just shows you where it is. I find it really funny that this cornerstone of a niche hex-based passive slowdown build was nerfed in such a way, but the idea of giving killers extra damage on their next generator kick if they didn't tunnel somebody was just too handholdy.
And then to build up on that, a lot of players felt that the solution in the previous BTB held their hand too much.
I am also the #1 hex build hater because they never fucking do anything. They're gimmicky builds that require hex undying and a killer with mobility of some sort, not to mention that survivors can completely ignore the hexes and complete generators anyway. Again, this was a build that slowed the game down in a passive way by making survivors spend more time doing something other than generators, but now it's fairly useless. Just tunnel the person who hops on your hex ruin so that their team doesn't know where it is and so that you have a perk going into the middle stages of the game. Why bother with variety at all? And past that, there are other builds that killers can run, but their gimmick takes away the killer's agency in the game. Every other build requires that the survivor gets caught out or egregiously misplays somehow to maintain some semblance of viability. In a similar vein, I'm tired of seeing killer players claim that a perk build is overpowered only for the build to be carried by a tunneling playstyle. Of course you're going to win more games if you kill a survivor immediately. That's not the build working for you. We also recently got the PTB patch notes for 9.4.0, the Vectua chapter, stranger on that thing. And I was surprised to see no mention of the hyper-focused stakeout build that's been running rampant as of late. And I get it, it's a response to full slowdown perks. I particularly hate playing against this build though, because it makes it seem like the only thing fun about Dead by Daylight is holding your left mouse button and completing QuickTime events. Since these perks are often combined with Prove Thyself and Deja Vu, they cause generators to practically disappear off the map, making the match shorter. In other words, this is the build that says that you want to play as little DBD as possible and still get the win. You're not playing Dead by Daylight when you run this build, you're doing chores, and I know what chores in video games look like. I play Warframe. The irritatingly positive note about survivors running the hyper-focus builds is that they very rarely run perks to help and chase or protect themselves from, you guessed it, being tunneled off of the hook. If I tunnel somebody out and they happen to have this build, then the game is slowed down to a screeching halt. If I tunnel somebody else out, then I can still apply enough pressure to keep the survivor with hyper-focus off of generators. With how frequent this build is, it's even more logical now to try and tunnel the first person I see. Not like they'd care anyway. They wanted the match to be over quickly. The only difference is that it's on my terms now. Circling back around to build viability, there's a plethora of high-tier, high-impact perks that survivors can run, and they're all good. As long as you keep your exhaustion perks separated, the other 3 slots can be a mix and match of a wide variety of good perks. I even put this to the test myself on stream, where I made it my goal to ensure that at least 2 survivors from every game, optionally including myself, escaped through the exit gates. My build was Borrowed Time, Babysitter, Will Make It, and Overcome. I played around 10 games of this build and only failed to meet my goal twice. If someone of my relative skill level on Survivor can be that consistent in this game, then there has to be something wrong. The problem was that I and my teammates were not threatened adequately by the killer, further exacerbated by how I denied them tunneling capabilities. If the killer wasn't turning around to kill my teammate off hook instantly, they would find themselves behind as they healed them with We'll Make It. If they did, then my teammate had 25 seconds of endurance and 30 seconds of haste thanks to Borrowed Time and Babysitter. And then if I were to trade a hit off of a hook, I could sprint away with Overcome and then heal myself in a corner with the medkit that I brought. The most popular perk in this build is We'll Make It, while the others struggle to crack the top 50% in terms of popularity. And despite that, I find that the results speak for themselves. I'm not saying that Survivor perks should be nerfed though, because having a variety of strong options to experiment with is core to the fun of any gaming experience, and especially one that's customizable as Dead by Daylight. It is fun when I can experiment like this. Instead, behavior really needs to stop nerfing alternate build strategies for killers so that they can stop feeling the need to run the same perks and tunnel in every game in hopes of pulling a win together. So while it is necessary to tunnel to maintain a hold over a game, the emphasis and encouragement of a non-interactive strategy on the killer side reduces the opportunity for skill expression, forcing both sides to adapt to the base mechanics of the game in an increasingly unskilled way. Sprint burst, playing blight, gen rushing, tunneling at 5, these are all annoyances of Dead by Daylight that most average players have when it comes to claiming lack of skill expression. You were carried by a perk, a killer's power, or a non-interactive strategy. You're crutching on these strategies if you use them and deserve to have your gonads boiled so that you don't contribute to the gene pool. But is wanting something strong inherently unskillful? What does skill expression in DBD even look like? In other games, the inherent skill expression is more straightforward. To ignore the nuances of their individual titles, an FPS player can get by in just about any game by having good aim. A skilled chess player knows how to achieve checkmate efficiently. In DBD, the binary result is an escape for survivors or a kill for the killers. And given how behavior treats MMR, this is how the game measures skillful play. When we are led to believe this escaped versus killed as the end-all be-all of how good somebody is at the game, though, we miss the point of Dead by Daylight's adherence to the asymmetrical horror genre and how different components of skill expression contribute to positive results. Simultaneously, while it is valid to get upset at Sprint Burst, it is not a perk that is always brought by an unskilled player. It's more that the usual method of punishing mistakes or the usual method of starting or maintaining chases is thrown out the window in a non-interactive way. The usual method of learned efficiency for a killer's power is also partially thrown away when they run full slowdown every game. Anybody running Corrupt Intervention, Pain Resonance, Pop Goes the Weasel, and Demon Switch can guarantee themselves more kills because of how they buy time for their killer, and not because of the efficiency of the killer player themselves. I also find it really funny when a high tier killer runs quad slowdown and crushes pub lobbies anyway. Like, you put me in the deep fryer and turn me into Dunyan rings. You clearly don't need all that to help you. I'm losing the plot a bit here, but let's get back to the original question. What does skill expression look like? And personally, I'd say that a skilled player is someone who has mastery over both the micro, individual mechanics, and macro, game state and map decisions, aspects of the game. For survivors, the micro starts with understanding how to loop, properly holding check spots and chaining resources together, or running loops in the correct direction is a skill that one learns with time and practice. I'm still learning this myself as someone who has most of their hours on killer, but what I can say is that the survivors who understand how to maintain chases and read my movements perfectly are some of the more impressive people to face. It wouldn't be good micro without understanding the killer's specific counterplay as well though, which is where the micro gameplay comes full circle. Knowing how to play a filler palette is one thing, but knowing not to camp a filler palette against Vecna is another. Then on the macro side of things, survivor players in general would greatly benefit from learning how to use their time on the map to its fullest, and that eventually losing a chase is expected as long as you buy time for your team. As a killer main, one of the simple skills that survivors need to start doing in my games is making use of the full 70 seconds that a survivor can stay on hook. In an ideal situation, the hooked survivor is available right as their timer expires, though this isn't always the case. The best practice is to wait until the killer is reasonably far away enough, usually by drawing them away from the hook, and using the time that the survivor is on the hook to work on generators otherwise. If the killer is aggressively proxy camping, well, that's 70 seconds of generators that they're missing out on. In most scenarios, you absolutely do not want to unhook a survivor while the killer is still nearby, because the loud sound notification tells the killer that there are two survivors behind them, with one of them being extremely vulnerable. I have to bring this up because I have played this game with people who claimed they were experienced, then they pulled these shenanigans and claimed the killer was tunneling. The killer wasn't tunneling, you're just bad at macro. Even if the killer is tunneling, you should leave the player on the hook for the maximum timer so that the killer plays towards the hook and can't pressure generators. The instant that more survivor players understand how to play the map more efficiently with this in mind, the easier their games become. And to some of you, this will seem like basic information, but there are a good number of people out there who haven't taught themselves how to play around the correct timing. Stop thinking about static phases where you have to go and do task A in a specific sequence, and more in terms of making the right time decision. Anyway, I would say that the greatest skill expression from survivors understanding how to combine these two aspects of gameplay together. Now, I've been watching Otofu play this game with his 4-man survivor squad, and it's pretty impressive how easy they make this game look. Part of the general map awareness and macro play is definitely helped by being able to communicate with their team. In solo queue, you don't get this kind of luxury, but it's still not an excuse to not use the base mechanics of the game. For the killer side of things, the micro gameplay depends pretty heavily on whom you play, since every killer has a unique power with its own relative skill floor and skill ceiling. The actual tier listing of these attributes is constantly under scrutiny and debate, like dear god, Twitter was alight for a solid week when Kaito's video came out. There's also a series of tier lists out there that ranks the relative strength of every killer's power, and even these videos are at odds with each other. Otstarva rates Deathslinger as a middle-of-the-pack killer, while Otofu puts him closer to the top 10. The truth of the matter is that a skilled killer player will know how to use their power to capitalize on survivor micro mistakes, punishing human error. I posit that the strongest killers are the ones that can consistently punish human error the quickest, with the largest margin of error for misusing their power. Strong killers also don't rely on mistakes as heavily, as their power is usually strong enough to make up for it. If you were to miss a Blight Dash, it's no big deal. The power's back up in a few seconds and lets you regain lost distance immediately with very little punishment for inaccuracy. You miss a shot with Deathslinger and the time that you lose is relatively substantial. By the simple nature of their powers, a player has to play a great Deathslinger game in order to consistently equal the results of alright Blight games. Now, I wouldn't say that getting good results is more impressive with a weaker killer power. It's more that the weaker killers have powers that are easier to counter on the survivor side. Good games on Trapper or Hag are more likely due to massive blundering mistakes from the survivor than playing the game well. Any killer can 4K, and every killer can have bad games if the person playing them doesn't have a good handle on them. The more complex powers are the ones that impress me more, because that player has to develop a very niche skill set that allows them to play in more unique ways. Killers with stronger powers simply bridge the necessary gap of dependency on human error. Similar to how Survivor Micro comes down to playing loops correctly, killers also have to learn how to play loops in a way that disrupts the survivor. A survivor might have a preferred way to run a loop, and it is up to the killer to interrupt that movement with the correct anti-looping methods. Both sides have the ability to misdirect the other, and it's these little mind games and reads that make every game feel different. Getting the correct soul read on these mind games as a killer can make you feel like you're on top of the world. And then reading a killer's mind game properly and doing the correct counterplay as survivor also feels just simply incredible. A killer that knows how to make these precise reads has a fantastic handle on their micro gameplay, and their powers merely make up for the relative sluggishness that comes with using basic attacks. Now let's move on to killer macro. Most of this comes down to controlling the speed at which generators complete so that they are given the most opportunity to kill the survivors. Pretty much every decision that the killer has to make revolves around their ability to stall the game out. When the killer knocks somebody down, they have to consider their ability to pick them up. If other survivors are nearby, the killer can't pick up because receiving a stun from a pallet or a flashlight will reset the time that they spent chasing that survivor. The longer that the killer spends chasing a survivor, the fewer chances they get to stall the game and put pressure on other survivors. The fewer survivors that the killer pressures, the faster the generators go. This is also why killers need to choose their cases carefully, because if the killer chooses to chase a survivor in a strong tile, like the main building on some maps or a shack, or on a part of the map where zero active generators are, they can lose their control over the game very quickly. Again, some killer powers are mobile enough to make up for the time-chasing survivors, with the more mobile ones being those that are generally rated the highest. Macro control becomes significantly easier when you're playing the Blight. Reiterating my list from earlier in this video, having 25% slower generator speeds by virtue of killing one player early is by far the strongest strategy, mostly because all 5 generators can be completed in fewer than 6 minutes, and the killer does not want that to happen. As I said earlier, it sucks for killers to have zero incentive to not tunnel. For some specific killers, it is the only way that they can retain a grip on a match, but like a smurfing Ashe main quick peeking every corner in an unranked game of Siege, it just sucks to face competitive players in public matches. This is also why I don't find win streaks very interesting, because most of them involve cheesing the macro this way. Power to you if you string multiple games together, it's just not for me. The most skilled players, in my opinion, are the ones that know the correct instantaneous micro and macro decisions, allowing their games to be varied and winnable regardless of circumstance. Idyllic, maybe, but a hell of a lot more fun than singling one player out immediately every game. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of the base mechanics in the game don't allow them to deviate from this strategy, and so playing against killers that tunnel all the time becomes really boring, and DBD itself becomes boring as a result. So to recap, skilled Survivor players understand how to run loops, counter killer powers, and general map timing and positioning. Skilled killer players know the best uses of the powers to shorten these things, know how to misdirect survivors in chase, and can correctly know when and where to hook, kick generators, and so on. Sometimes some players might be more prone to human error, some might be more competitively minded. Every game yields a different set of results, which is at the crux of what makes DBD fun. Outplaying someone because of a correct micro or macro play is immensely satisfying as an expression of skill. And that expression of skill I don't think is very well represented when killers tend to tunnel, even though it has become increasingly more necessary. I also strongly believe that Dead by Daylight's perk bloat, alongside a lack of comprehensive tutorials to explain most of the game's base mechanics, has led to a collection of generally unskilled players who over-rely on a narrow handful of overpicked perks to compensate for their lack of skill. Even worse is when somebody intentionally plays poorly because they know their perk will save them anyway. I'm looking at you, Sprint Burst. It annoys me that we have people who think that they're outplaying the killer by using sprint bursts like that because they're just making up for bad macro play. They don't know that sprint burst gets you a ton of distance because you move at 6 meters per second for, that's not who I want. You move at 6 meters per second for however many seconds, like 3 seconds, right? And that gets you so much distance. And when you're not using that to make distance, it pisses me off because then people are like, oh, well, I'm just gonna walk until the killer whiffs right next to me and I use sprint burst. But you don't make any distance. You just walk to the same tile that you would have made it to before, but you don't obscure your position. You don't make life easier on yourself. And like this guy who kept walking with his sprint burst, you're just dead because you don't know how to play the macro correctly. It pisses me off because these are going to be the people who are like, well, this killer was fucking tunneling and they don't know how to play the game properly and they should have just let me use my sprint burst. It's like, no, you're playing the game like a fucking moron. And then I'm going to be the one penalized for your stupidity. You have so many opportunities to actually turn the game in your favor and you're just using it in the worst possible way. Anyway, you can shoot through those fence bars. Hope you understand that. May crashing out? Yeah, a little bit. It's one of my biggest pet peeves right now. Lethal Pursuer for killers and Sprint Burst for survivors, because both of them are just used by people who are generally do not know how to play the game. Even though this perk has been untouched since 2017, the rediscovered synergy with Vigil, Witness Opportunity, and the newest perk Finesse practically guarantees that you can never misposition yourself. If you're a good, skilled player, you should basically never get hit by a C tier or lower killer with this build. In most cases though, this happens to be the build that is brought by overconfident TTV and Anon mode players who call you slurs in the endgame chat for playing the game in a way that got them killed. Playing like this is so fundamentally flawed that it's baffling to me that survivors still do this. You're not using a perk, you're making up for bad positioning intentionally by crutching on it. This is just bad microplay being supplemented by perk bloat. Even more annoyingly, there are some of you out there that are genuinely good at chase, and seeing these builds in the endgame scoreboard is so disappointing. There are so many builds out there that you could be using or experimenting with because your micro gameplay is good enough to not have to rely on the same 6 perks I see every game. Instead of showing off your hard-earned ability with something inventive, you've landed on the default nothing build. Again, this is perk bloat overriding skill expression in DBD. It's difficult to know if somebody's actually skilled at the game when this build exists as it does. The same goes for the hyperfocus and stakeout builds. Why would you bother learning good positioning when you can hold M1 and complete quicktime events? Wow, isn't this gameplay just so engaging? This is the build for Sable mains because you get to play DBD one-handed. This is why I think that competitive DBD is an interesting viewing experience, because it gives us a glimpse into what the game could be if perk bloat wasn't a problem. Some might argue that DBD needs a competitive mode, but given DBD's current state, I doubt it would be handled properly. In order for it to feel competitive outside of what we have now, there would need to be perk and killer-specific restrictions in play, otherwise every ranked game would become worse versions of what we already have. Without perk restrictions, for example, every competitive game turns into 4-man squads running Decisive Strike, and playing this hypothetically untouched ranked game mode becomes a button that says play Blight and Tunnel or suffer the consequences. I think it would simply take too much fine-tuning from behavior to coordinate such a queue. And the other question is, how do you handle solo queue players? They're already a tough subject in the base game itself, so how does a solo player properly ingratiate themselves into an even sweatier game mode? It's kind of impossible. The closest thing that we are ever going to get to a competitive queue is the ranked DVD Discord, which I'll link down below. Tunneling is still a thing there, but at least you'll have a team that can coordinate with you to hopefully offset that inevitability. As I've said many times though, I wish tunneling wasn't such a baseline requirement of the game presently. I find DBD to be its most fun when the 42 killers and over 300 perks interact with each other in ways that are reasonably powerful while giving both sides agency over the game. Maybe I'm finally understanding that this is how the game always has been though, and my wishes are nothing short of delusional optimism. Whatever the case, this is my biggest hope for Dead by Daylight in 2026, that we can give killers incentives to not tunnel so that both sides can stop running the same perks in every single game, and we finally return to form with skill expression. And that's all I have for this video. Thanks for watching, safe travels, and goodbye. Oh, and one more thing. To those of you commenting that tunneling isn't necessary, did you actually watch the video before you chose to get mad at its title?